The dark times isn't all there is. The light things are there too. The hope is there. The growth is there. The strength and development in positive ways and the contribution to others in our lives in positive ways is also there.
Hey guys, it's Seth, and welcome to another episode of Look Up and Move Forward. Now, this is a show I co-host with my friend Carrie M. Wrigley, and Carrie is a licensed therapist, and these are essentially conversations that she and I have about motivational and inspirational and practical ways in which we can find hope and move forward through these really dark times. And today's episode is a really good one. Yeah, how are things with COVID and restrictions over where you're at? You're in Utah, right?
In Utah, yeah, it's relatively mild. I mean, you still have to wear, a mask when you go into a store, into a restaurant, whatever, but we're all outside hiking and walking and, that's been fantastic. So yeah, that doesn't require a mask. And so, and in my office, I have, the 6 feet, so I don't have to require people to wear a mask when they're counseling with me and stuff like that. So I know we have a significantly more freedom than a lot of people do in a lot of states, which I'm grateful for.
Yeah. And for me, like I said in previous episodes, my anxiety was not tied to necessarily the COVID as a disease, but really the COVID impacts, as you had phrased it, and a lot of the political or civil unrest was really like that was something that I was like, I was so tense about that, because it's just something that was outside of my realm of control. Like I could control, what supplies we had at our home and, what my kids are doing and not going to playgrounds or certain areas. But the civil unrest or the political unrest, like I can't do anything about that. And so when I talked to you back in June, my anxiety was through the roof because of all of these current event situations that were going on. I had no control over, and I really could not focus at all on anything other than current events and politics and news and what was happening. And it really, it really poisoned. It was really poisoning my life. And that was what I expressed to you in the phone call. That was really what started this, this podcast. And it was really interesting because in talking to you and then editing the episodes, the first few episodes of our podcast, I really internalized a lot of that information that you'd shared. And a fascinating thing happened. I could actually recognize, okay, so there's a lot of things that are outside of my realm of control, but there are a few things that are inside of my realm of control. And fascinatingly enough, one of the biggest things that I could control was whether or not I opened up my phone to follow the news and the politics. And I recently turned it off. I dismantled, I guess is the phrase, disabled my Instagram account because I didn't want to see news, people fighting each other. And I just spent more time with my family, my kids, and my children, they're all under the age of 4. They were thrilled with this extra attention. So they're super happy to have me invest more time in them. And then their happiness is contagious, right? It makes me happier. And so it was just this really wonderful thing that I gleaned from our conversations about what was within my realm of control and focusing more on that.
It's such a lovely example. And I'm sure that, with your kids having more of your time and your attention, one of the reasons you're happier is because they are probably misbehaving less, because they didn't have to go, hey, dad, oh, I need to get his attention by throwing this and by making, and by tugging on you and by, they're just like, hey, dad, you're like, what? And they're like, oh, can we play a game? Sure, kid, or whatever. Rather, hey, dad, 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 dad,
That's so true. So true. So true.
And it really is, it's really, mood is so contagious. It's been known for a long time, of course, that depression is contagious. And in our current environment, a lot of times we assume that's because of scary genetics and whatever. And if you have the scary gene, then your kids are doomed to have it. That's not proven to be really true, because it's just as contagious among people who don't share genetic material, you know, among spouses who aren't physically related, at least we hope so, um, among roommates, among, you know, best friends, among co-workers. You know, depression is incredibly contagious. And it's not always about genes. More often it's about this kind of stuff, you know, because if dad or the boss or, you know, whoever is, you know, stressed and angry and working, you know, too hard or you know, whatever, it's going to have an impact on everyone around them. Whereas what you experience as a father is so powerful, that just one person getting to a different place, a happier, more peaceful, more centered place of control and positive focus, it has a contagious effect on everybody. And that's one of my favorite things about this kind of work, is not only do I see people heal, I see families heal. I see communities heal when one person starts to get it. And it's so very powerful. And for all of our listeners out there, you know, you can be that one person, like Seth was in his, that one person that gets it, that sees things just a little bit different, so that suddenly the world starts to look a lot brighter than it might have yesterday. I have this image that I have just loved for years, that I use in some of my websites and other things. I just think it's so beautiful, of that moment when the sun starts to come up over the mountain, you know, and all night the mountains have been there. But I've actually had the experience. I live in Utah, so I'm surrounded by mountains. You see these kinds of mountains right outside my front window, the Rocky Mountains. And I've been down to Zions and different things, and I've literally watched the process of being outside at like 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning, when everything is like completely dark. You know, you see, and maybe you see stars in the sky, but as far as the landscape, it's just completely dark. Like when I was in Zion National Park one night doing this, you literally could not see the skyline, but you know, where the sky stopped and the mountain started. But somewhere around 3 or 4, maybe 5 o'clock in the morning, depending what time of year, you started to see there's just a little demarcation between the edge of the mountain and that dark sky. And the lighter it got, the more that demarcation appeared. And this is probably, I had to guess the time on this photo, maybe 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning on a summer's day, you know, where you can see just this beautiful, radiant stuff. Well, that sun was there the whole time, but we couldn't see it the whole time. Those mountains were there the whole time. Those green trees are there the whole time. When it's dark, we can't see things as they really are. But the normal cycle of life is we cycle between night and dark, between you know, day and night, between periods when we can see clearly and things when we can't. And in those times, and you mentioned in June, you were there. We were all there in June or thereabouts, where everything's so dark and so hopeless, and like, how in the world could this ever work out? Well, the very movement of the sun across the sky every single day of our lives can remind us, no matter how dark it gets, you hang in there for a few more hours and baby, the sun's going to come up again, you know. And that's what I really, really love about this image. And I think in times like we're going through right now, it's so important to keep that in mind, that even if things are really hard, really tough, not to give up. Now, the other thing that I wanted to share, based on what you said, is this concept that I learned about first from Steve Covey's wonderful, wonderful book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Steve talks about 2 different circles, and they're very, very significant. The first is what you mentioned, the circle of concern. These are things that we might be concerned about, that we might be worried about, okay? And like for so many people, we're all so worried about what's happening around us, what's happening with the election, what's happening with Black Lives Matter, what's happening with the riots in the streets, what's happening with the global warming, what's happening, that we can be concerned about so many things, or they might be more personal things. For a lot of women I talk to, it's, is my husband looking at pornography again? You know, or for a parent, it might be, you know, is my kid actually going to school and did they do their homework? Or it might, you know, there's a lot of things we can be concerned about, but that we don't have any direct control over. And what Steve basically says in his book is that if we let that circle of concern dominate our consciousness, which you said is happening to you in June, when, you know, the news was ever present and all the stuff and you were constantly watching it, it can literally just cloud our awareness, you know, make us scared, make us frightened, make us feel powerless, make us feel depressed. And honestly, I have to wonder sometimes if that's kind of the goal with some of the 24/7 news cycle that seems invested in creating fear and creating division and creating all this kind of stuff. And most of all, leaving us feeling powerless. We talked about that, I think, in our first episode, that the only thing you can do to fight COVID is social distance and wear a mask. Well, those things might have some usefulness, but certainly there's so many other things that we can do with that particular problem that are in our control, like how are you eating? Are you exercising? Are you sleeping right? Or are you up all night watching CNN, getting scared?
Yeah, exactly.
So the circle of concern, when we focus mostly on that, it takes us out of our control zone. It makes us scared. It makes us, depressed. It makes us anxious. And it can make us angry. Whereas what Steve said is there's another circle that is called the circle of influence, okay? And he represents it like this, as a circle within the other one. These are things that we do directly control. What time do I go to bed? Okay. Did I play with my kids today? Did I, put my clothes and makeup on and actually get dressed today? Or did I just walk around in my sweats all day and feel slovenly, Did I actually check in with that neighbor across the street who's been struggling to see how they're doing? Or did I just sit, again, in front of CNN or Netflix, either focusing on the problem or trying to distract myself from the problem, with media? Circle of influence is about what we have the power to do ourselves. And the beautiful thing is, as you experienced, our circle of influence can either grow or shrink depending on how much we let that circle of concern dominate. Now, here's a picture that represents what Steve said about, the kind of state that you described being in June, where your circle of influence is teeny tiny. You're so busy watching CNN and watching those riots and watching all those people go crazy. You don't have time for your kids. You don't have time to take a walk outside. You don't have time to have a healthy meal. You're too busy focusing on CNN,
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't just you. I think most of us were in that state in June, But over the time, we get smarter. We say, you know what? There's a lot of things I don't have anything to do with. I don't control, but there's a lot that I do control. There are a lot that I can do for my health, for my family, for my community, for my faith, and so on. And what Steve basically says is the more that circle of influence grows, the more attention we're giving to the things that we control, that we have power over, the more it literally crowds out our awareness of those things that we can do nothing about. And as that circle of influence grows, as you experience within your own family, it doesn't just help your own mood, it helps your positive influence to grow in a positive way, spreading that light, spreading that positive energy to the others around you that you care about. So that's the circle of concern versus circle of influence that I think is so important for us to keep in mind right now.
That's interesting too, because you had mentioned, you're either watching the news, you're consumed with the problem, or you're watching Netflix or something and you're distracting yourself from the problem. But the effect is still the same. The result is the same. You personally don't progress. You don't do anything. And I'm someone who believes very firmly that the number one thing that got me out of my multiple depressive states was doing something. And it didn't have to be something big. It just had to be, I was taking control of some of the chaos in my life by doing something, by some sort of action, and it could be just really simple, like making a very small goal and accomplishing it that day, and there's something about that, something about doing something, and something about creation, like as an individual creates something, it doesn't have to be wildly artistic. It can be just making a video and putting it up on YouTube. Or
I made an omelet yesterday for my kid. He was so excited that I made him an omelet, because usually I'm too busy, in my normal pre-COVID life, I didn't have time to make an omelet. I was running around there. And I found that too, that, doing something, and especially those creative somethings, that we create something ourselves, is such a powerful antidepressant, because not only are we doing something, we're making the world better. We're making it brighter. We're making it happier in ways that we may not have had time to do back in the old normal, And that's one thing that I've realized, is that there's some lessons from this new normal that honestly, I don't want everything to go back to exactly the way that it was when we're done with all this. There's some things, there's some lessons I've learned, some ways I've grown, some ways my family and relationships and time management has changed that I want to keep from all of this. And I've heard that from a lot of other people as well.
Oh, I agree with you. One of the first things that I saw, what in the first quote unquote 15 days to slow the spread was, there was a little image quote that had come up and it says, I don't want things to go back to the way they were before. I want them to be better than they were before. And that's something interesting, it's hard to imagine that there is a possibility of something better, all things considered, but keeping in mind that the myth or the story of the phoenix, right? That bird that turns to ashes, it burns itself, and then it rises up as something far greater than what it originally was. And perhaps that is the situation in which we currently find ourselves right now.
There's so many elements like that in nature. One of my favorites, besides the phoenix, is the butterfly, where you start with this little teeny tiny caterpillar that crawls along the ground or crawls across the bark of trees or whatever. That's all he can do.
You don't need to do the sound effects.
Learn it from my boys. But anyway, after a while, that's not good enough. He has something else inside of him that he can become. But he doesn't instantly grow wings and become this beautiful, powerful butterfly. Instead, he goes into this dark place, into this cocoon, into this restrictive, pressurized, ugly, dark, scary, confined place, and he's there for a while. And while he's there, he's not conscious of growing wings on his back. He's not conscious that his colors are changing. All he's conscious of is, oh, this is uncomfortable. Oh, this is awful. And again, he's a caterpillar, so maybe he's not conscious at all.
But he's not saying it in English, at least, right?
Right. But he's caught in that thing. But then the day comes when he's grown enough that his wings and all of his new self doesn't fit in that little cocoon, that chrysalis anymore. And so it starts to crack, and gradually light starts to pour into that little crack, and gradually he's kind of moving through it. It's intriguing to watch a butterfly come out of a chrysalis, because it's not all at once. It's just this little edge and this little edge here and this little edge here, and finally you see this kind of pop out, and finally he reveals himself, and he's still kind of wet, can't fly quite yet, but he pops out and he's standing on top of a little twig, and then finally he dries off and he has these beautiful wings, and at some point he lifts up his wing and he flies in ways he could never think about as the prior version of himself, the little caterpillar falling along. And I just really trust that we all start as caterpillars, and that it's our destiny ultimately. I truly believe we're all children of God, and that it's our destiny to be something, to end as something far, far greater than we began, But that process is not easy, and there may be one chrysalis in our lives. There may be many. I think there are usually, a series, more like a snake skin, that, every year our old skin becomes too tight for us. So we have to shed that one and reveal a new one underneath it. And, we get bigger and stronger with each thing. Or a tree, there's that every year gets a new ring. It expands, it expands. And I think that's, there's so many symbols in nature like that, of becoming something better than you knew how to be previously.
Yeah, that's interesting. M. Scott Peck, in the book The Road Less Traveled, he talked about depression, and it was fascinating the way his take on depression was that it was essentially, this was his opinion on it, was that it was essentially a product of a natural byproduct of not being able to progress in some way. And he said sometimes people were dealing with trauma that they just didn't know how to resolve. Some people didn't know, they were transitioning into a different part of their life. They had just graduated from their master's program. They didn't know what they were going to do at that point. They didn't really know. And so there's this feeling of inability to move forward or progress in some way. And so he had said, depression is a byproduct of that feeling of being unable to move. And I think a lot of, lockdowns and restrictions and things that are going on right now. I mean, that it does, it really makes it difficult to progress or to have any sense of what the future
I
is
think
going
we
to
all kind of feel like that little caterpillar caught in the chrysalis right now. Just, I
be. Yeah,
can't do anything, you know,
yeah,
and
yeah.
yet
And
we can
so,
transform the inside if we're smart. Yeah.
well, and if we're able to, if we're able to some degree be a little bit more objective about what we're experiencing, and maybe see it as that instead. Just having that perspective on maybe this isn't the end. Maybe this is the end of an older life, and I'm going into a much better life. You know, just that thought could really transform the entire outlook, the entire attitude, like you said, the attitude is contagious, right? You could take what you're going through right now and have a much more positive experience than you would otherwise.
So, you know, as you say that, Seth, about big, huge changes like, you know, graduations and different things like that, being able to trigger depression, I find that to be so true for my clients and certainly in my own life as well. I think back to one of the biggest depressive episodes I ever went through. And it basically, ironically, was right after I finished my master's degree as a counselor, you know. That was a little bit ironic, you know, that here I am finally trained as a counselor and, you know, finishing 20 years of formal education. And I fall into the deepest pit of my life, feeling like, oh, you know, I'm worthless and I'm, you know, there's nothing for, it took a long time to figure that out, why I went in so deep, you know. And I finally figured out that that's exactly why, because life as I had known it had completely changed, 100% changed, you know. While I was in school those 20 years, I had friends, I had teachers, I had stuff to do, I had places to be, I had a sense of purpose in every single day, I had tasks to accomplish. And the day after I graduated, I had none of that. I was a newlywed and my husband was still working full time and he was really had a very active responsibility in our church that kept him, you know, busy with the teenage boys in our area almost every night. So I'm in the house day and night with nothing to do, wondering how to spend my time, wondering if I've just wasted all this time and money, you know, wondering what my life is going to be. I have no sense of what's coming, you know. And in many ways, what I went through then, I think is kind of what we're all going through now. We're stuck in our houses wondering, you know, if everything that we've been is ever going to be relevant again, if we're ever going to be able to continue on with our lives in a new format. But what I found during that period of depression, I was really, really depressed for about a month and a half. And then my husband made the ultimate threat. He said, honey, you better figure this out or I'm going to drag your butt to a counselor. I'm like, no, anything but that.
You are the counselor. He could have dragged you to a mirror, right?
Right. Yeah. So what I finally figured out is exactly what you said. I needed to do stuff. I needed to find things to do that were meaningful and that were sweet. And I realized during that period of time, as I think a lot of us are realizing now, there are things that I could do in that less scheduled, less structured condition that I could never do when I was busy with school and work and, you know, play practice and whatever else I was involved with during my busy season. I found whole new dimensions of my purpose, of my identity, of myself, of my use of time, to the extent that by the end of that 3-month period, by the end of that summer, you know, when I finally did get a job and, you know, then my life changed again, I was kind of sad to leave behind that little 3-month cocoon of not having, quote, anything that I had to do, because I finally learned to structure my time, to structure my sense of purpose in ways that were useful, you know. And so that period ended up being really foundational for me, really transformative. And I've thought of that period a lot as I and all of us have gone through this period of, oh, life as I knew it is over and I can't do all the things that I used to do and I can't be with the people I'm used to being. And, you know, it has been a time of a potential for new discovery, new exploration, literally growing those new wings within ourselves, you know. And then the other time I think about, besides that early period of unemployment and transition after graduate school, that really, you know, your comment reminds me of is the period in 2001 when I lost my youngest child. And that literally brought forth all kinds of things I needed to learn in order to get through that very, very difficult crisis in my life, that very difficult transition, because that was the end not only of that baby's life, but also of that period where I'd been a mother, at home whose focus was bringing children to the world. All of a sudden that was over, But that time in particular, the things that I learned in 2001 to 2003, basically, about getting through hard things for myself ended up being what I've since taught about, taught my clients in my counseling office about, written a book about, taught hundreds of people at a time in seminars about. And so I've been personally transformed by my own tragedies, my own challenges, my own stresses. And that's why when a new client comes in my office and sits down and starts to cry about, this or that, or their grief or their whatever, of course I'm compassionate, I'm empathic, but honestly, I'm also excited for them because I know I'm meeting them in their chrysalis. I'm meeting them in that dark space where they're being transformed. And it's just going to be a matter of time before we can help them learn what those new wings are, what those new colors, what those new purposes, what that new identity is. It doesn't happen all at once. But as you said, that's such a powerful, different way to view depression. And I'm sorry, you have a chemical imbalance in your brain that means you're sick for life. Instead, to see it as a temporary period of adjustment, change, and growth that we can learn through and then move beyond, as we apply things that are helpful.
I remember actually when I listened to your talk, and you were talking about you said a phrase in there about genetics, about depression being a genetic disposition, and you just said that's not very helpful to me because then people just feel stuck. And I was like, yeah, exactly. That was
I'm stuck with this broken brain forever, and so are my kids, and so are my grandkids, and everybody who has the misfortune of being genetically connected to me. Yeah, it's a very, very despairing perspective.
Exactly.
A depressing perspective. Yeah.
Very depressing. In fact, when you had said that, I immediately thought of, I have a family history of mental illness and depression, and I thought, I thought that, I'm like, you're right. Like, it's not helpful to me to blame my situation on someone else. Like, I guess there's some temporary relief, like, oh, maybe it's not my fault. But there was no long-term relief from blaming my situation on someone else. And so acknowledging that I had some sort of control over my situation, that it wasn't my ancestors' fault, that I was the way I was, that I had control. That was liberating, and that was empowering, and that was really what just drew me to what you were talking about.
Even if your grandparents did struggle with it, or your great-grandparents, or however many generations, it can change with you. And then you can pass it on so your kids have a different experience, and their kids, and their kids, and their kids, and their kids. They still may have the evil gene, but they don't have to have the same experience if they don't have the same perspective, if they don't engage in the same behaviors, if they're not doing the same things. There's this whole new science now that's thrilling. It's called epigenetics. That basically we can have genes, but they can either get turned on or turned off based on what we do or don't do, how we live or don't live, okay? And that there are literally situations that we can control, that we can learn to actively make decisions about, that will either turn those genes on, and then yes, we have the diabetes, or yes, we have the heart disease, or yes, we have the depression that our ancestors struggled with, or we make different choices and those genes literally don't get turned on. We literally have control over that in very, very powerful ways. And I think that science of epigenetics is so empowering and so helpful, because for a long time, for decades, we've had this sense that, oh, I am defined by my genetics and by my family history. That's just not true at all. It doesn't have to be true if we take on a different and more hopeful perspective.
It's interesting while you were talking about, some of the more difficult times in your life, like with your master's degree, and that was a period in your life where you learned a lot. For me, in my limited experience, one of the most difficult experiences for me in my life was when my wife and I were at grad school, and she was gone most of the time at grad school and left me alone in a home. I was looking for jobs, but in the meantime, we had this really crappy home that we bought in Florida for dirt cheap. And, we just needed to remodel it. But when we say we, when you're in a marriage and your wife says we, she means you, like we should do that. We should fix those things. But it means me. And so I didn't know the first thing about home remodeling. And that was the time when I learned, I just pulled up YouTube videos and I was learning everything about, and I hated it. I hated it so much. I probably swore in that house more than anybody who had ever lived there at any given time combined. Like I trying to fix those things in that house. But now, now that I'm a father and when things happen in the house, I know how to fix them and I can fix them fast. Like that very difficult, arduous experience in my life has actually served me very well.
Yeah.
And not just me, but my family, my kids who need it, there's certain things need to be fixed around the house immediately. And I know how to do it, and it doesn't cost us $300 or $400 in repairs. It's just something I can quickly do. And it's something very arduous, something very difficult has actually turned out to be extraordinarily beneficial.
Seth, as I hear you talk about the learning experience you had with that, it reminds me of a model that I learned in graduate school that was so hopeful for me because it gave me hope for my own learning experience. That basically was that there's 4 stages of the learning and growing process. And the first of those stages, they called unconscious incompetence. And that basically is where you don't yet know that you don't know. You're unconscious of the fact that you're incompetent in a given area, right? Which is what some people refer to as ignorance is bliss. Well, it really isn't bliss. It's just incompetence that we're not conscious of, right? and you probably see it in your little kids right now, when a kid is 2 or 3 years old, they don't know or care that they don't know how to ride a 10-speed or kick a soccer ball across the field or do quadratic equations. They don't know or care. They don't even know those things exist yet. That's unconscious incompetence. We all start in that state by definition, but as we grow in maturity and awareness and ability, we grow into stage 2, which by far is the most uncomfortable of the 4 stages. That is conscious incompetence, meaning now I know that I don't know. And it's terrible. And I feel stupid and I feel worthless and I feel awkward. And basically conscious incompetence is where every formal training experience, it's when you get the kid on the bike and maybe they still have the training wheels, but now they need to push this foot forward and then this foot forward and then this foot, and they have to learn how to steer. And eventually they get okay with that, but then you take the training wheels off and then they have to learn how to balance without falling over and so on, So conscious incompetence is where you're bad at it. That you don't know something you would like to know. And it's uncomfortable and it's yucky and it's hard, and it's an essential part of any learning process. That's what you're going through, it sounds like, with home repair stuff, is what I was going through in graduate school. So what I think we're all going through now in this new normal world is, where none of us are very good at managing this yet. It's uncomfortable, it's yucky, it's whatever. But then that leads to the 3rd stage, which is called conscious competence. And in that stage, now we know that we know how to do it. And we still might have to think about it a little bit. We still might have to remind ourselves, the kid on the bike, okay, we'll push this foot, then this foot. I remember what Dad said about keeping upright or whatever. We have to remind ourselves of the things that we know. It's not yet really internalized, but we can do it because we can keep reminding ourselves how to do it. And then finally, the 4th stage of learning is the mastery stage. It's called unconscious competence. That's where it has become so natural, so normal for us to do whatever we've learned how to do. We don't have to think about it anymore. A few months ago, when I first had to get on Zoom, it was terrifying. I think we've all had to go through all 4 of these stages dealing with Zoom, because how do you light an environment? How do you use the screen share button? How do you put something in the chat? How do you, it was at first, it was scary. After a process of time, it's no longer scary. It's just become the new normal. We're good at it. It's a new skill that has opened up all kinds of new doors for us. And I personally look forward to the day when we don't have to be on Zoom all the time. That's already happening in my practice. It's about half and half now. About half of my clients still do Zoom, and the other half are actually coming back in. But it becomes part of that new network. And I find there's a whole bunch of new people that I can serve, including hopefully those on our podcast, because guess what? I learned this new skill of dealing with Zoom from this crisis that we've all been through. So in all that kind of way, the very things that the times that are uncomfortable for us and terrifying and yucky can end up being some of the most important learning processes and change and development processes of our lives. And it's hard to remind ourselves of that when we're in the hard part, that phase 2, or like, I don't know what I'm doing here, But it's nice to know that model, so that we can say, okay, I don't know what I'm doing, but that's okay. Because gradually, a little day at a time, I'm learning a little bit more of what I'm doing. And I'm not going to be perfect at it yet, but that gradual step-by-step process is leading me toward eventually being not just competent, but masterful and powerful and exercising this new skill.
As a writer and someone who just loves a good story, I'm very familiar with what's called the hero's journey. It was introduced. The concept was formally introduced by Joseph Campbell, and he talked about it in the book called The Hero of a Thousand Faces. And essentially, I mean, there's a pattern of all the really good stories of a hero and what they do, and essentially, it's what you were just talking about, is that they move from a state of incompetence, or like they're completely naive. They don't know what the real world is like. And then they're called into a brand new world, whatever that was going to look like, just something outside of their comfort zone. And along the way, they meet friends and enemies and experience challenges, and they drop down into what's called the abyss. That would be the chrysalis in this situation, right? When we're talking about, they drop into the darkest pit in their life, but then they emerge from that pit with knowledge or a skill or a gift that enables them to overcome the final obstacles. And then they take that gift back home, and they'll bless their community with whatever they've learned or they've become or they have, and Joseph Campbell said this quote, and I'm paraphrasing, I don't know the exact wording, but he made this quote which is just so poignant. He said, inside the cave you fear to enter is the treasure you seek.
Oh, I love that. That's awesome.
And it's so true. Like it's the things we are most worried about, anxious about, but when we face them, even though we think there's a dragon in there, the dragon is what's guarding the treasure.
Yeah.
And sooner or later, you could either face that dragon when he's really small or as he gets bigger, but at some point you will have to face that. Like, you can't bury these problems forever. And if you face it and you overcome, the treasure's yours, and you save a community, from who you become in that process. And I just love that. I love that. Inside the cave you fear to enter is the treasure you seek.
Yeah, that discussion of the hero's journey reminds me of an image that we shared in one of our previous episodes. That was an image that was taken of me at the very top of a mountain, a very, very difficult mountain that I shared in a past episode. I climbed barefoot, and I was so thrilled by the time I got to the top of that mountain, and the perspective that was there and the beauty that was there. That's really what we want to go for as we go through our trials and challenges, to just see it as a magnificent unfolding adventure where we get stronger and more courageous and more capable of blessing the lives of those around us in positive ways, and seeing things that we can't see in any other way than to climb those hard mountains. Like you say, we can't get that treasure unless we go through those dark caves sometimes, and as we engage in that kind of perspective, that sort of positive perspective, it can literally transform the experience that we have of our dark times. We can anticipate that beautiful morning sunrise, even in the midst of that darkest midnight. Because we've been educated by all the mornings before, by all the victories before, by all of those experiences of mastery and growth. And we can look forward to that even in the midst of our most tearful, most sorrowful, most difficult times. So as we finish up this particular episode, I hope that we can all kind of keep that in mind. We're probably in for still some other, days, months, who knows how long, of some difficult times. But the difficult times, as we talked about, in one of the previous episodes where we showed this picture behind me, the dark times isn't all there is. The light things are there too. The hope is there. The growth is there. The strength and development in positive ways, and the contribution to others in our lives in positive ways is also there.
Thank you so much for watching this episode of Look Up and Move Forward. If you enjoyed this episode, please give it a 5-star review and share it with your friends and family. Now, there are many, many more episodes on their way, so please be sure to subscribe. And we'll see you next time.